Offspring of incest. What's your story and how is your life? I have some acquaintances, two Indian sisters, adopted by an American family when they were babies. Apparently they were the product of their uncle raping their mother. These girls grew up to be gorgeous geniuses, so it worked out okay for them. Well, technically it'd be their father raping their mother. Still ducked up though. My brother is my father. It's ducked up. My mother groomed him from a young age to be her perfect lover, and they had me when he was 17 and she was 35. I grew up thinking he was my brother and that my dad had left the family. But I found out the truth when I walked in on my brother and mother having sex when I turned 14. I was absolutely horrified and I confronted them and they told me the truth. I felt betrayed and disgusted, so that night I took my belongings and left home. Haven't spoken to them since. They were the only family I had since my mother also left her family and never spoke to them again at a young age. I'm 24 now. My great-grandmother married her uncle. My grandma is an odd one. She would probably have been diagnosed with developmental disabilities had that been a thing in the 1930s. Hard to say if that's a result of the incest though. My great-uncle, grandma's brother, is normal and fine. Well, you see. It all started when my dad broke both his arms. My sister-in-law is a French teacher in an area of Ontario that recently received a large influx of Muslim families. In Ontario, students learn French in elementary school. My sister-in-law was teaching her class elementary school French for aunt, uncle, cousin etc, and about half the class put up their hands. All recent immigrants. They wanted to know what word to use when your one parent is also the cousin of your other parent. They don't teach them those words anymore. Well, not really the same thing, but worth mentioning. My mom and dad aren't genetically related, but were kinda childhood friends who eventually got married. When they were both teenagers, their pairs of parents each split up, and my mom's mom married my dad's dad. So I don't really have a traditional two sides of the family, but a weird tangle of marriage and divorce, and it's kinda hard to keep track of who is related to who by blood. Also, my parents only got married because they got pregnant with me. So I joke with them about how I am an incest-born bastard child. At least my parents and I have a sense of humor about it. But everyone else seems to ignore it entirely. I had a sexual relationship with my first cousin and ended up pregnant. I am on a throwaway and going to keep my details as anonymous as possible. I was in my teens. He was in his 20s. I was on birth control, the pill, and pretty much fell in love with my cousin. He was, and still is, the only person to ever make me feel aroused and attracted to. He's the only person I've had that strong connection with. I think about those months we were together often. I found out I was pregnant and I ended up saying it was another person's child. Not to prevent myself the shame of people knowing I was having sex with my cousin, but to spare my child the shame of being an offspring of incest. Both my cousin and I are intelligent, and I have to say our child is ridiculously smart. Our child is great looking, with a wonderful and loving personality. There are not any genetic issues. My cousin is not in our lives. He went on to get married and does not desire children. No one knows or suspects, but our child looks more and more like my cousin as our child ages. So much that my aunt has to suspect. We have looked at my cousin's baby pictures together, and the cousin and our child are basically twins, but she has never said anything to me. I don't plan on ever telling our child, as I cannot see any benefit of him or her knowing. My parents are first cousins. I only got some hormonal problems, but it's not too serious. It's really embarrassing. The younger ones in my family don't know it, and neither do any of my friends. It would be horrible if they knew. A girl in my school once joked about my parents being cousins because I'm Middle Eastern, and I nearly got an heart attack, but I just laughed it off since I knew it was just a joke. A question asking about incest, with no serious tag. Getting really good replies. Did Reddit just make history? I work with two children who were born because of incest. The boy's microcephalic, small head, cerebral palsy, severe attention developmental delay. He's almost a teenager but is as functional as a 6-year-old and is on a toddler education level. He will probably need care his whole life. His parents were uncle niece but his mom was delayed as well. The girl was born from a brother and sister. They have 4 kids total and she is the only one with issues. I swear she has Marfan syndrome. Her joints are incredibly loose and she has very long fingers and toes. Her brain isn't able to process light properly so she's legally blind. She's also severely autistic which is probably unrelated to her parents being siblings but it actually benefits her because she's incredibly smart. She's 10 now and is learning to communicate well and is excelling in school these days. She's actually starting going to regular school now. In a special class because she's blind. But we have hopes that she will be able to go to the normal classes in a few years. She's still not potty trained. But that's expected when you have her level of autism and being blind. The worst thing I've ever seen as a pediatric CNA isn't the children from incest though. It's the children from parents who drank or did drugs while pregnant. Such beautiful children who would have been perfectly fine if their mothers hadn't put poison in their bodies. To be honest, I didn't consider myself a product of incest until I read the comments here. My parents are first cousins. I come from a country where that's normal and lived all my life in another country where it is the norm. I think I'm pretty normal and my siblings too. We all ended up being atheists in a country where you can get held for that. Smart and open-minded. So in the eyes of my culture there's probably something wrong with us. I think first cousins only counts as incest in cultures areas where it is considered a societal taboo. If that's normal where you come from then you wouldn't really feel any adverse consequences of being a child of incest. I just don't think cousins is the same hardline definition as siblings or parent-child. Or even aunt or uncle-child. I have 2 siblings-in-law, adopted. Obviously, who are the product of incest. Both have mental deficiencies. One is in legal trouble relating to child porn. The other has Prader-Willi syndrome. Meaning they will eat anything and a huge amount. Due to never ever feeling full. Neither will ever live completely independently. Off topic. But Prader-Willi is not something caused by incest. And the risk for it isn't increased by incest either. Not me but a kid in school that I work sub at occasionally. His mother is the direct product of incest. Her father raped his daughter. And he is an absolute delight. Let me tell you. He spends most of his time in a special ed classroom with 3 or 4 other students. And he is always helping out his classmates and his teachers when he can. He saw me at a local event and wanted to introduce me to his mother. She's got no teeth. And just looks ragged and worn. But she is one of the sweetest people I've ever talked to. He'll be alright. I think he's being groomed to be a custodian or something. But it's nice to know that such horrible conditions don't have to define an individual. I, myself, am a master of the custodial arts, or a janitor if you want to be a big dig about it. My old neighbor was the product of a father raping his daughter. She had some cognitive impairment that seemed like early onset dementia, but was very slow to progress. Diabetes and tons of mental health issues, hoarding, schizophrenia, agoraphobia, just about everything imaginable. If it was a thing back then. She would have also been on the autism spectrum. She had 2 children herself, non-incest, that were profoundly mentally ill and also somewhat intellectually disabled. The son was a horribly abusive paranoid schizophrenic and the daughter was a hoarder. They were all living together off of disability. Police raided their home and found they were living in filth with the dead rotting bodies of their pets everywhere. And the entire building was condemned by the health department. The son and daughter, adults in their 50s, wandered off never to be found. Their mother became homeless and ended up in a state-run nursing home. We were her only visitors. Jesus duck. Your comment is the first one on here, as of my reading. And I think I'm done. Good night, Yael. Peace and love. In my mother's family, there was a lot of sexual abuse. Especially from a stepfather. My mother is the oldest of 7 siblings. She has 2 full siblings. And the other siblings are clearly of another father. Trust me, they don't need a DNA test. For years there was a question of who fathered who. But now that everyone's an adult, their character, their traits, it's just too obvious who fathered who. Because of how much sexual abuse went on. A lot of kids were born from those half-siblings. Considering the number of problems that range from physical abnormalities to mental disorders, I'm thoroughly convinced that at least some of these kids are a product of incest. And not all a matter of she whored around at 15 like they would lead you to believe. It isn't that far-fetched considering he did. In fact, great some of them. One of these uncle cousins was feral. His mom was young, didn't know what she was doing with a baby, and left him in the crib all the time. He didn't get enough stimulation. No one talked to him. So he became feral. It's a sick situation. He's in his 40s now and can hardly carry on a conversation. He is a good guy but tends to fall for a lot of conspiracies and other nonsense. He's never had a career. He slurs his speech and can barely understand basic concepts. Out of everyone in the family, he is probably the best living example of how that family treats human life, like garbage. Basically, no one stepped in and fixed the problem. Thankfully my mother did not, to my knowledge, get abused by that man. Her little sister did, unfortunately. And my grandmother has since divorced him. These aren't rednecks either. They live in New York in a suburban community. These aren't ghetto thugs. Needless to say, I stay far away from these people. My parents are first cousins. They share the same grandfather. It's not weird at all in my family. It's talked about openly for as long as I can remember. I remember hearing stories about my mom and dad growing up a couple streets away from each other. My brother and I are not affected at all by them being first cousins. Just the divorce, alcohol and drug abuse growing up. Meh. My parents were step siblings. They were raised together from young teenagers, but didn't have me until my mom was 28 I think. Anyway, my father robbed a convenience store while my mother was pregnant and was in jail for 4 years. He got out and they got back together. He did a bunch of heroin 6 months later and me and my mom found him dead. 6 months after that my mother dropped me off with some of her junkie friends and never came back. They left me at a church and eventually the police found me. My mother was found dead in her car from an overdose the next day. My grandmother swears she was murdered by the mob for threatening to inform on them about my father's death. I really have no idea. But I think it's her coping strategy. I was raised by my mother's mom and father's dad. And they were extremely normal college educated people. I've got a host of the mental issues my parents did but I keep putting one foot in front of the other. Telling the story of my parents just sounds like it happened to somebody else now. Not so great. Actually, my father, who suffered from severe mental illness, died before I was born. My mother died in childbirth. So I was mostly cared for when I was young by my older brother, who seems to have inherited whatever mental problem our father had. We traveled around a lot when we were kids. From city to city. Never staying very long. We were even across the sea from home most of the time. My brother was abused. Physically, sexually and mentally. Never had any real friends or family who weren't awful. My brother made me marry some guy we didn't even know. Whose language we don't even speak. Just because he had some money. He raped me. Every night. 4 years. My brother got mixed up in some shady anti-government stuff and died. And then my husband went into a coma the same day our son was stillborn. It's gotten a little better recently. Though. Just a year or so since that day. And now I've got 3 healthy children. A better personal life. And I'm the ruler of a small city-state. Soon. The Targaryens will return to Westeros. There was a woman in my pregnancy and infant loss group that had a really tragic case of accidental incest. We live in a town where there's a military base and soldiers from Great Britain often come and train there. Well, this woman met a soldier at the club one night and they hit it off and started seeing each other. They discovered they both had family from a little obscure town in England. She was born there and her mother brought her to Canada when the mom split up with the dad. She grows up not ever having contact with her father as a result. Anyhow, this girl ends up pregnant by this soldier and doesn't get proper prenatal care other than her anatomy scan at 18 weeks. When the baby was born, he had severe deformities and was lacking a bunch of his bones in his limbs. At Children's Hospital, they do a genetic workup on the parents and baby, and within a couple of days, the baby dies. The genetic counselor ended up contacting the lady and telling her she needed to come in for an appointment. She does, and it turns out that her and the soldier are half siblings, and they both had a specific gene mutation that had been passed on to their baby, resulting in whatever disease caused him to not develop parts of his skeleton. In the course of a few days, she lost her baby, found out her boyfriend was actually her brother, and went off the deep end and started using all kinds of drugs. Listening to her story made me feel uncomfortable and physically sick. It was awful. I felt sorry for her but also felt disgusted, even though I knew it wasn't really her fault. I am not her offspring but was a teaching assistant at a private school for children that were either the public school system kicked out or could not handle. I'll never forget this girl. Her grandpa was her father. She was 19 or 20 and had to wear diapers all of the time. She suffered from severe autism and was the absolute sweetest girl. This was a couple of years ago, but if I remember correctly, she was doing schoolwork at about a 2nd to 3rd grade level. The last day of school, her and almost all of the kids were so sad and did not want to leave for summer, as we were pretty much the only steady constant figures they had. I actually ended up seeing her while I was walking home from work about a year after the school closed. She still remembered my name and gave me a big hug. I'll never forget it. My mama is from a tiny town in the deep south. But contrary to popular belief, there was very little actual incest and breeding going on, and trust me, I would know if there were. My relatives are vicious gossips. A couple of first cousin marriages, but even that was very rare. It used to be more common among upper class southerners. Think Ashley and Melanie from Gone with the Wind. But my mother's family are all dirt poor sharecroppers. There was no wealth to keep within the family. There is, however, one bizarre couple from my mother's hometown. A guy married his stepmother. Now, this would be merely questionable if she had, say, married his dad when he was 18 or older and a more or less independent adult. But no, she married his dad when he was like 8 or 9. Then like 10 years later his dad dies, and the stepson marries his stepmom. Then they had a couple of kids together. I always wondered what the dynamic was like in that family. Dad, mom is being so unfair. I know. She was like that to me when I was your age. My mom was raped by my uncle as a young teenager and became pregnant with me. I was raised not knowing about this for obvious reasons, but found out years later when I was in my early 20s and my uncle and father came to visit my mother after being absent from her life for over 2 decades, trying to apologize for what he'd done and make amends. I did not find out he was my father until after we had hung out a bunch and been hunting and fishing together. He initially told me that my mom didn't like him because he never stood up for her against their abusive father. He and I became close and he started helping me out with a small business that I had taken over from a friend. But then eventually the truth came out and he told me about how he and my mom were actually involved sexually with each other from a young age due to them both being abused by their father and their crazy mother. I had no idea about any of this since I was never told about my real grandparents. Eventually the consensual stuff between my mom and uncle got pretty involved until she realized it was wrong, but he still wanted it, and ended up raping her. That's when he ran out of her life. But he had no idea she got pregnant with me because she got married soon thereafter. When I was a little kid she got remarried and had another kid. My half brother. Mom and I became estranged when I was a teenager and I ran away. But recently we had grown closer since I came back to where she was living with my now grown up half brother. She died not too long ago and I think my half brother had something to do with it. I know he's not the product of incest, but there is something definitely wrong with him. He was checked into a mental facility after he started thinking he was her and wearing her clothes like some kind of freak. I still don't trust him. I hate talking about it, but here we go. My grandparents on my father's side are first cousins. My father and all my uncles and aunts have their share of problems and all are a little off. Generally low IQ for most of them, but there are a few that are pretty smart and well off. We have a range of health problems which may be a result of this. Diabetes, heart failure, blood pressure, and cancer all run rampant through my father's side. There are, I believe, 11 aunts and uncles, unless I'm forgetting one. Which is possible, and only 2 of them have no medical issues. It's hard to give out so many details and remain anonymous because of how ducked up my family tree is. I was adopted at birth because of the ducked up life my biological parents lead. I have a lot of biological siblings and a few adoptive siblings. I knew mostly nothing of my biological siblings until I got older, in my teens. My adoptive family was actually one of my uncles from the incest line, who I call that rightfully so. I have blood pressure issues despite exercising and eating proper. I also have physical twitches that sometimes are uncontrollable. Some days are fine and I have none. Other days are embarrassing. Most of my biological siblings have kids that they can't afford or have lost to the state. Most of them will not work. 2 of my fully biological sisters have tried killing themselves numerous times, from taking meds to slashing their wrists. One of said sisters is an alcoholic. Hardest part to believe. I have unfortunately slept with one of my fully biological sisters. We knew when we did it. Both were drunk and didn't care. Years ago. I am mentally here for the most part. But things like the above statements are signs that I'm not. I have issues with depression and general coping issues when something major in life happens. My biological siblings are all the same way with depression and coping. I know it affects us mentally, and I'm sure it's not just coincidental the health problems we all seem to face. It doesn't help having a low IQ family, but adding incest to the mix really ducked us over. There are very few people that I know aside from family that actually know about any of this. I have 2 friends who know about my family history, my grandparents. The thing with my sister. Over several years ago. Lived in emergency housing project in a famous university town. 2 prostitutes were moved into the apartment below mine. They were sisters. One was 19. The other 15. Both were doing crack. The 15-year-old was, by then, 8 months pregnant. While there, she had the baby taken off her. We all thought because of the drug use. 8 months of sheer hell before they got evicted. I had to keep calling the police because of the drug-fueled violence. Attending officers were always unsympathetic. One point, I was even threatened with a ticket for wasting police time. I was given a whole load of shit from both the police and the housing people. 5 or so years later, a local police sergeant was convicted of raping his daughter and sentenced to 10 years. As I recall, the local paper published his picture. It was one of the officers I dealt with over these 2 girls. Then I recognized the family resemblance from the picture of the police sergeant to that of the 15-year-old girl. The paper also listed the great crime that was consistent with the girl's arrival in the apartments. The news story also detailed a conspiracy within the local police, where the rapist sergeant was earlier caught in a supermarket taking up skirt photos of children. I shit you not, and it was kept under wraps directly by the police chief, and the sergeant was actually returned to his duties. After the girls were evicted, I was hounded by the housing people and the girls' drug dealing friends until I got my degree and got the duck out that place. Shortly before I left, I last saw the girls separatal occasions. The older sister was with some pikey thug with babies in tow. The younger girl was walking past me with a can of special brew, totally guant and lost. Duck Cambridge. Duck what they did tell their kids. Smug drug taking posh sheets and junky trash. Put that duck pile in the rear view and moved across the planet.